Right now, somewhere in his routine, a man over 60 is doing something he never used to do, and he probably hasn't noticed it yet. Maybe it's the way he lingers over coffee without checking the time. Maybe it's the silence in the house that no longer feels like a problem to solve. Something has shifted quietly without an announcement, and it's happening in thousands of lives just like his and possibly in yours. You keep missing it because it doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as an absence. The absence of a small tension you'd carried for so long you mistook it for personality. There's no single moment to point to, no conversation, no argument, no decision, just a slow settling into something that used to feel impossible to name. Here's the question I want to sit with today. What is it that single men over 60 actually discover about themselves? Something so specific that even when love is offered again, a real part of them hesitates to trade it back. By the time this video ends, you're going to see that thing clearly. Not as an abstract idea, but as something you can point to in your own life today. It starts with something as small as what he eats for dinner. No negotiation, no checking in, just his. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man's evenings once he's living alone after decades of shared decisions, and at first it feels almost too ordinary to mention. He decides what's on the plate. He decides when the television goes off. He decides without a second thought what time the lights go out. None of this sounds significant on its own. Of course, plenty of married men also enjoy quiet evenings, and context always matters here. But there is a difference between having space and taking space, and the men we're talking about aren't just occupying an empty house, they're occupying themselves again, often for the first time in years. Psychologists sometimes describe this as reclaiming autonomy, the restoration of a person's sense that his own preferences are allowed to exist without being weighed against someone else's first. It sounds simple when you put it that way. It rarely feels simple to live inside a marriage where every small preference gets quietly negotiated down. Watch for this in the way a man over 60 talks about his week. He might mention that he rearranged the furniture on a whim or that he drove somewhere on a Tuesday afternoon for no particular reason. There's a specific, unhurried tone in how he says it. Not defensive, not proud, just matter of fact, the way you'd describe breathing. Now, you might be thinking, couldn't this just be the normal adjustment anyone makes after a big life change? And sometimes, yes, it's simply that. But here is the detail that separates a temporary adjustment from something deeper. The adjustment fades with time. This doesn't. If anything, it settles in and becomes more comfortable the longer it continues. The common mistake is assuming this is just getting used to being single, a phase that will wear off once loneliness catches up with him. Most men who study this in themselves discover the opposite. The comfort deepens rather than dissolves. There's a related detail worth pausing on. Friends and adult children often expect this phase to look like drift, days blurring together, a man quietly coming undone without a partner to organize his life. Some of that does happen early on, but for a specific group of men, something closer to the opposite unfolds. Routines sharpen. Meals get simpler but more deliberate. The house gets quieter, but somehow more his. This isn't independence for its own sake. It's the return of a self that spent years accommodating someone else's rhythm before his own. That small freedom, it turns out, is only the surface of something much older he's finally allowed to surface. Somewhere past 60, a strange thing happens. The quiet in the house stops sounding like absence. For most of adult life, silence carries a kind of implicit alarm. An empty room after a long relationship can feel like a symptom of something wrong, a signal that connection has failed, that something needs to be fixed or filled. That's the lens most men carry into their 50s, and it's the lens that makes solitude feel frightening long before they've actually tried it. But there's a meaningful distinction between isolation and solitude that most people never learn to separate. Isolation is imposed, it happens to you, and it comes with a felt sense of exclusion. Solitude is chosen. You walk into it on purpose, and your nervous system reads it completely differently. The same empty room can feel like abandonment in one case and sanctuary in the other. This distinction sharpens specifically with age. Younger men are still building careers, families, reputations, and solitude during that season genuinely can mean falling behind. But past a certain point, most of what needed building has already been built. The urgency drains out of the room. What's left is just him, and increasingly he finds just him is not the emptiness he feared. You can see this shift in small, observable ways. A man in this phase will often describe an evening alone not with the word lonely, but with the word peaceful. And he'll use it without hesitation, without the little defensive laugh men sometimes attach to that admission. That absence of defensiveness is the tell. People rarely need to perform contentment they actually feel. Of course, this doesn't apply universally. Some men remain genuinely isolated well into their 60s and 70s, and no reframing changes that reality, loneliness is loneliness, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than romanticized. The difference lies in whether the solitude was chosen and tended, or simply endured because nothing better came along. There's a further wrinkle worth naming here. Even chosen solitude isn't a straight line. A man can feel entirely at peace on a Tuesday and then feel a genuine pang of longing on a Sunday evening, watching a couple walk past his window. That contradiction doesn't undo what we've just described. It simply means peace, in this context, isn't the absence of occasional longing, it's the absence of dread. He can feel the pang, sit with it, and go on making dinner without it spiraling into panic. That distinction, dread versus a passing pang, turns out to matter enormously. It's the difference between managing an old wound and living inside one. Remember what I told you at the start, that there was one thing single men over 60 discover that makes going back feel like a step down. We are getting closer to it now, because what he hears in that silence, once it stops frightening him, turns out to be something surprisingly specific. What he hears eventually is a version of himself he'd been managing around for decades. Of course, none of it was cruelty. It rarely is. It was just smaller over and over for 30 years. Long marriages run on compromise, and most of that compromise is invisible even to the people living inside it. You don't remember the 10,000 small negotiations, which restaurant, which route, which version of the story gets told at dinner, because no single one of them was worth remembering. But the body keeps a different kind of account than the mind does, and after enough years, something in a man begins to feel the accumulated weight of all those small subtractions, even without being able to name a single instance. Behavioral researchers who study long-term relationships describe this as compromise fatigue, a gradual erosion of individual preference that happens not through conflict, but through the ordinary maintenance of harmony. Nobody sets out to disappear a little. It simply happens one reasonable concession at a time, because reasonable concessions are what keep a household running smoothly. Here's where it gets specific. A man newly on his own will often notice, almost involuntarily, exactly which parts of his old routine were never really his. The radio station in the car, the temperature on the thermostat, even which side of the bed felt his, and which decisions about vacations, furniture, or Sunday mornings were quietly settled somewhere he wasn't in the room for. This does not mean every marriage silences a person, and it would be unfair and inaccurate to suggest otherwise. Many long partnerships genuinely honor both people's preferences in equal measure. But when a man over 60 describes his newfound freedom with unusual specificity, listing exact small details rather than vague generalities, that specificity is diagnostic. Vague nostalgia for freedom sounds different from a precise inventory of what was quietly given up. You might be thinking, isn't this just complaining about marriage in disguise? It's worth being careful here, because that's not quite what's happening. Most of these men don't speak about their marriages with resentment. They speak about them with something closer to fondness mixed with clear-eyed recognition. The two feelings coexist without canceling each other out. The common mistake is assuming that naming these small losses means he wants to go back and relitigate them, or that he's bitter about the past. Almost never. What he wants is simply to keep what he's recovered. The small, specific ground of himself that took 30 years to quietly give away and only a few years alone to notice was missing. Before we move on, there's one additional layer most explanations skip. Compromise fatigue doesn't just erase preferences. It can quietly erase a man's confidence in having preferences at all. After enough years of deferring, some men genuinely forget what they like, not because they lost interest in life, but because the muscle of choosing for themselves went unused. Rebuilding that muscle takes longer than expected. It looks at first like indecision, standing in a grocery aisle, unsure what he actually wants for dinner, because for 30 years, that question was never really his to answer alone. That hesitation isn't weakness, it's a muscle waking back up after a long sleep. And recovered ground, it turns out, is something women can read on a man before he ever explains it. She won't say it directly, but she notices almost instantly whether a man is running from being alone or at peace with it. This is where female psychology becomes genuinely relevant because none of this internal recovery stays internal. Women who date or meet men later in life often describe an almost immediate read they get within the first real conversation, long before any vulnerable topic comes up. Researchers call part of this behavioral leakage the way internal states surface through small, largely unconscious cues in posture, pacing, and word choice, regardless of what someone is actually saying. You cannot fully perform peace you don't have. The body tends to give away the difference between someone who has done the work of being alone and someone simply avoiding it by rushing toward the next relationship. Here's what this looks like in practice. A man at peace with his solitude tends to speak about his life in complete sentences that don't require another person to finish them. I've been enjoying my mornings, rather than, I've just been so lonely, it would be nice to have someone. He asks questions with genuine curiosity rather than evaluative urgency because he isn't auditioning her for a role he desperately needs filled. One instance of this means very little on its own. Plenty of nervous first dates produce awkward sentences that mean nothing about a man's inner state. But a pattern across an entire conversation, sustained without visible effort, is very different from a performance. Patterns are hard to fake for an hour straight. Single moments are not. Now, you might be thinking, surely some men are just naturally calm speakers, regardless of their relationship history. And that's true. Temperament plays a role. But what women consistently describe noticing isn't just calmness in general, it's calmness specifically about being alone, which is a much narrower and more telling signal than simple confidence. The common mistake men make here is trying to manufacture this signal directly, practicing calm lines, rehearsing unbothered phrasing without doing the actual internal work the previous chapters described. That effort almost always reads as exactly what it is, effort. The real version isn't something you perform, it's something that shows up on its own once it's actually true. There's a related piece worth sitting with, because it explains why so many men get frustrated trying to shortcut the process. Women who've dated after long marriages often describe a specific fatigue with men who talk about their independence a little too insistently, as though repeating the word fine enough times might make it true. That over-insistence reads exactly backwards from how it's intended. Genuine peace rarely needs restating. It shows up in what a man doesn't say, almost as much as in what he does. Think back to a conversation that once seemed ordinary, one where the other person walked away with a clear read on you, even though you never said anything particularly revealing. That's this mechanism at work, quietly, in both directions. Of course, this doesn't mean a man needs to hide that he's been through something difficult. Vulnerability, shared honestly and without urgency, lands very differently than vulnerability used as an appeal for reassurance. The difference isn't the topic, it's the pace, and whether the sentence is looking for a witness or a rescue. That's a subtle distinction, but women tend to feel it almost immediately, even when they can't articulate exactly why. That signal is the one thing almost no man realizes he's already giving off, and it's the most overlooked part of this entire shift. If you asked him directly, he might struggle to name it, but ask him to go back, really go back, and something in him simply won't. This is the part almost nobody talks about because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It isn't a grand declaration of independence. It's something quieter and, in a strange way, more permanent, a settled, unhurried self-respect that doesn't announce itself but also doesn't negotiate. Unhurried self-respect is different from confidence, and the distinction matters. Confidence can be built quickly, sometimes even performed under pressure for a job interview or a first date. This is slower. It's the accumulated result of months, sometimes years, of a man discovering that his preferences, his silence, his recovered ground, and his newly steady presence around women all belong to him now, not conditionally, not on loan, but as his own. You can hear it in how these men talk about potential relationships going forward, not with fear of being alone forever, which was the old motivator, and not with desperate hope either. Instead, there's a kind of calm evaluation, a willingness to walk away from something that asks him to quietly give pieces of himself back the way he once did without noticing. Of course, this doesn't mean these men reject love. Many of them want it genuinely and go on to build meaningful relationships later in life. The difference is what they'll trade for it. The old version of him might have traded his preferences, his solitude, his sense of unhurried ownership over his own days. This version won't not because he's become guarded or cynical, but because he now understands exactly what those things cost to rebuild. You might be thinking, isn't this just a nicer way of describing stubbornness or fear of commitment dressed up as wisdom? It's a fair question. But stubbornness resists change out of anxiety. This resists a specific kind of change, the kind that requires quietly disappearing again while remaining genuinely open to everything else. That's not the same thing at all. The common mistake is assuming a man like this is closed off. He isn't. He's simply no longer willing to pay with pieces of himself for company he can now provide, at least in part, for his own life. There's one more layer to this worth naming, because it's the part almost every conversation about single men over 60 gets wrong. The assumption is usually that these men are protecting themselves from getting hurt again, armor essentially dressed up as wisdom, but talk to enough of them and a different picture emerges. Most aren't afraid of getting hurt. They've already survived that more than once and know they'd survive it again if it came to that. What they're actually protecting is something quieter and in its own way more valuable. The specific shape of a life they finally built to fit themselves after decades of building around someone else. That's not fear, it's stewardship. And stewardship, unlike fear, doesn't shrink a man's world. It just makes him selective about who gets invited back into it. This is also, in a strange way, what makes these men more available for real connection rather than less. Because whatever they choose next, they're choosing from steadiness instead of scarcity. There's no desperation driving the decision. There's no countdown clock whispering that time is running out, that this might be his last chance, that he should say yes before someone better comes along and takes it. That particular pressure, so common in men who never did this work, simply isn't present here. And its absence changes everything about how the choice gets made. That's the shift. And once you've seen it in yourself, you start seeing it everywhere else too, including in how she responds to it. Everything we've walked through today points back to the same quiet idea. The small freedoms, the solitude that stopped frightening him, the 30 years of quiet subtraction he finally noticed, the way women read peace before a word is spoken, and the unhurried self-respect underneath all of it. These aren't separate discoveries. They're one discovery, seen from 5 different angles. The zoomed-out truth is simple, even if living it took decades. Freedom, at this stage of life, isn't about escaping connection. It's about no longer needing to disappear in order to keep it. If any of this resonated, you don't need to overanalyze your own life to find where it applies. You'll know it when you notice it, usually in something small, the way it started for the men we talked about today. There's no checklist to work through. It's simply a matter of paying attention to what already feels different and trusting that instinct. I read every comment on this channel, and I'd genuinely like to know, if you're a man over 60, what's the one freedom you'd never trade back? Tell me in the comments. On this channel, we look closely at the parts of female psychology and later life relationships that most people talk around instead of through, which is exactly why it's worth staying close for what comes next.